Shall we dive in then?
Yeah, if you're ready.
So tonight I'm going to talk about contributing to Rails. This was something that I always found kind of interesting to think about, especially when I was starting. Seemed like, that's loftier goals than I will be able to make. And turns out, I actually ended up working on a bug on Rails way early on. So we're going to touch on that and some recent contributions I made. But we're going to go through, what makes a good contribution to a library or a framework like that. It's huge. There's so many people working on it, and there's a lot of you're writing code that someone else has to maintain probably, so it's not like working on your own open source project. So it's whatever their direction they want to take it generally is if you're adding new features. So we'll touch on that. We'll touch on finding something to contribute because it can be hard to find what does Rails need. A lot of it comes from GitHub or Shopify or Basecamp pulling features out of their products and adding new stuff to Rails. But there's tons of other things you can do like documentation and bug fixes and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that as well. And then the process of contributing, and we'll kind of get into some of the code that I actually wrote because of it's a complicated framework. And I mean, it took me several days to figure out how to do some of this stuff, which won't look that complicated, but figuring out where, their organization comes into play can be really time consuming. So we'll talk about building a feature or bug fix, testing it, and then submitting it with a pull request to Rails. So I have 4 commits to Rails, which is pretty cool. I'm tied with, I don't know, probably hundreds of people for 1,011th place. Once you get into double-digit contributions, there's very few people, so you rise in the ranks really fast. But there's, 5,300 people who have contributed to Rails since, when did it come out? 2000? Yeah, something like that. And then they've moved, hosting for Git and all that. I don't even know if they were using Git back when they started. So some of the history may have been, lost or whatever. So we'll take a step back and talk about when I got my first computer that was actually mine. I used Ubuntu 7.04, which you can see here, and that was where I started getting into open source, and it was rough. So I had this HP laptop that it turned out was fairly compatible, but back then you installed your own drivers, configured things. I remember installing the NVIDIA driver 15 times because I'd screw it up and then be stuck in the command line. And my parents had dial-up, so I couldn't really Google much and fix it, so I just reinstall and try it again. And doing that on dial-up was a pain in the ass. So I ended up writing these tutorials, trying to document my notes for other people that had the same laptop or a similar one, and maybe help them, set up their computer with Ubuntu. And over time, I was well, I really want to get into programming though, so ideally I would contribute something back to the community, not a tutorial, but actually some code. So I came up with the idea of I have high-speed internet at school or my dad's office or whatever. What if I built something that I could download software on their computer, take it home, and try and install it? And if you've ever used Linux, the installing of packages is kind of a pain if you're offline because unlike Windows, where everything's packaged in one installer and all the dependencies get installed with it, Linux is basically you're going to need this other stuff, go figure it out. And you have software that does that, but not when you're offline. That's really hard to do. So I wrote in Python a program that would go do that called Carex and just put it up on the forums and told people it existed. And there's several 100,000 downloads now, which is insane, but it was my first actual project I did that was open source. And it's cool to have seen so many people use it and kind of inspired me I want to do more open source stuff going forward. So that was sometime early college, like freshman year, sometime around then. And then I got into Rails between junior and senior year, I believe, somewhere around then. And I ended up working for a professor at SIUE. You remember Pamela Gay in the physics department?
Yeah.
She had grants to do Moon Zoo and this Zooniverse stuff. So she had funding to hire Rails devs to build like sites like this, where these are photos from like the Hubble telescope of galaxies, and they basically had this site, which I don't believe is up anymore, but it would show pictures of these galaxies, and then you would go and help categorize them. You would choose, is it clockwise, anti-clockwise, elliptical, whatever, and classify and help that. So that was where I got into Rails, and Ruby is a very different language than Python, even though it looks similar syntactically. It works very different. And I remember being asked to do something on the sidebar, like we were doing like content navigation with breadcrumbs, where like you would click on something and it would open up a subnav and stuff. And I didn't even know how to do nested lists. And I was learning Rails, but not actually learning Ruby. And so at the time I was like, man, I'll never be able to like contribute to Rails, even though that seems really cool. So senior year, worked on a project for for our senior project, was for the admissions department. We built this app that replaced a form on a website that submitted to a Perl script, which sent an email to the admissions department, and then they would take that email and copy and paste it into a spreadsheet, and then use that to try to organize their tours of campus back in the day. It was ridiculous. So we built this in Rails, and I actually, as I was building this, ran into a bug in Active Record, which I thought was like weird, because I figured any problems I ran into were going to be my fault, because I didn't know anything at the time. So I go to GitHub and add an issue for it and a pull request, because we eventually figured it out. It took a long time. And the guy on GitHub that reviewed it, was like, great, good job with the code, but you need to add tests. And I was like, how do I do that? And he walked me through it. So people in the Rails community are extremely helpful. If you want to contribute to Rails or other open source projects like Devise or Pundit or whatever, you pretty much just have to ask or poke around and hang out in the issues and talk to people. So the issue that I made was I guess they used to use Lighthouse, but I think I ran into a bug that someone else had already reported. So I made a pull request for it that fixed it, and it was just a super simple little thing that at the time, I don't even know if it works this way anymore, but if you had loaded your active record query into memory, it kept track of that with the loaded ? Method. And for some reason, empty didn't work, because it would either return count would either return a hash on a group by query with subcounts in the hash, or just a count itself. So I ended up making this little patch that got accepted to Rails back in 2011. So it wasn't that long after I got into Rails that I made my first commit, but it was this year when I did my next one, which was 8 years later. So luckily I've been able to do a few more this year, which is fun. And they just kind of progressively go into more stuff. If you find stuff like that, they're kind of isolated, but I've been working on Action Text and Action Mailbox, those two new features of Rails 6. And they're kind of interesting, but no one's talking about them. So I was trying to just go through and document how they work. And of course, as I go do that, I start finding little bugs and just okay, I can contribute docs, fix this, add this feature or whatever. And it just, can quickly spawn into, eventually I might become a Rails core contributor, which would be kind of neat. So we're going to talk about ways to contribute to Rails. One is by adding documentation. Obviously, it's a big framework. There's tons of methods. There's tons of code in there. There's so many other libraries like JBuilder and you name it. There's always an opportunity to contribute docs, but that's probably not the thing you're most interested in doing. It's not really that like challenging or glamorous or anything. And then you have another option is to fix a bug in Rails, but it's hammered by thousands of developers every single day, so your chances of finding a bug kind of slim. So you can't really like reliably contribute fixing bugs, but they're always welcome, of course. And then the last kind of option, which is maybe the hardest, is adding new features, because you have to add new features that Rails core wants to support, and you're basically handing them features that they have the responsibility from now until forever to maintain, and you just built it, and that was it. So potentially you build it, they merge it, and you disappear, and then who's going to maintain it? Someone has to. So it can be hardest to add new features unless they're really in line with something they want to do in the future, which we'll talk about in a bit. So what I've been working on lately is just understanding how action text works. This is a feature of Rails 6 that came out. It was briefly talked about, but didn't sound interesting, and people were like, cool, all right, on to the next thing. And what it is it's a WYSIWYG editor for Rails, and it's integrated with active storage, so you can do file uploading out of the box, which is nice. And that's all people really talked about with it. But what's really neat is that action text has the ability for custom attachments. So this tricks editor is the JavaScript side of things, and it's always had support for embedding whatever you want in there, like videos and all that kind of stuff. So that is like what people talk about, but those custom attachments you can actually use to do things like mentioning other users, or like on GitHub you can reference another repository in an issue or a specific commit and that sort of thing. And it's set up too so that when you do this by saying @ and the username, just like you do on Twitter and Facebook and GitHub or wherever else. So you can build that functionality into Rails, and that's right, like the real cool magic of action text. Like it takes care of all of that serialization for you, the rendering. What's neat is this right now will embed, my name is Chris, but if I go and change it and you refresh the page, it will render my current name, whatever I change it to. So that is one of the things that like people were just ignoring in the past, where it is actually saving a reference to the database record and rendering that fresh every time that you see this, which is cool because in the past, if you did user mentions, you would just insert the raw text into a text column in your database, and then the user changes their username, you can't parse that and update it to the current thing. So this makes all kinds of things really nice. And it has some cool functionality where if you wanted to add, say, YouTube embeds, actually putting the YouTube video in there in the editor is not like the most useful thing because it's kind of hard to work with an iframe when you're editing a document. So they have different ways of also choosing what displays in the editor and what actually renders when you display it. So you can display an image in the editor for the thumbnail of the video, but then the actual video when you're displaying it. So I was going through and learning how all this works, and effectively it's just this. So you have whatever model you want, you include this action text attachable concern, and that module adds some basically some methods to determine what templates it renders and how it serializes it and all of that. And what actually gets inserted in the HTML is these action text attachments with an SGID on them. There's some other attributes like content type that are not super relevant. The main thing here is the SGID, which is a signed global ID. And a global ID looks like this, where and this is what Rails uses internally for associations with active storage and active job and that sort of thing when it's referencing a model and passing it around. So this global ID just basically is a format, has the model name and the database record ID and the end. And then the SGID is a signed version of that so that you can't, if some user changed it to point to user number 2, it would not be signed correctly and it would ignore it for security. And when it renders out that user that you mentioned, it will go and render out the to partial path, which is always the model name folder plural and the partial for that with the same model name underscored. So action text kind of takes care of all of this stuff for you to pull all of that off. Except when I tried it, when you go and mention a user and you hit edit, it just shows up like this and it didn't display that user again. And I was like, what's going on here? So it wasn't working right. And then I'm poking around and I find this like to tricks content attachment partial path in the module that is the method you have to define or did have to define to actually make it display on edit. And I tweeted George, who works at Basecamp, and actually extracted this and put it into Rails. And I was like, hey, should this be the same thing? And part of contributing to pretty much any open source project is like, you want to talk to the maintainers and say, am I understanding this correctly? If you find a bug, report it to them before you do too much work trying to fix it or something, because maybe you misunderstood it and end up going down the rabbit hole of trying to fix something that wasn't a bug. So I messaged him and he said, yeah, it sounds like it's a bug. And so I went to go fix that and go find it in the code as to, why is this going wrong? So there's a module inside of action text that when it is rendering it out for the tricks editor, it converts all those action text attachment HTML tags into an attachable object, and then it tries to call that method to tricks content attachment partial path. And because that's not defined by, or wasn't defined by default, it just ignored the user or anything that you added as an attachment by default, which they were working on it at Basecamp. They probably already had that method and didn't notice this was kind of weird. So my goal was just to fix this and add a default method there for that. So it would always have something by default and you could change it to whatever. Because really we want that same user, because it's just a partial for the user mention. We want it to be the same on the create, on the edit, on the show. We want it to look exactly the same everywhere just so it's consistent. Except for the case of like the YouTube video where you want to display a thumbnail only in the editor. So that's why they have this method and why it's named like that ridiculously long method name. So to start contributing a fix, the easiest thing to do is just clone Rails to your machine and then change Rails in your gem file to the local copy of it. Then you can throw bybugs or binding.pry anywhere you want, poke around, fiddle with anything and see what Rails is doing internally. Because action text was like jumping between files constantly and trying to, there's like, 5 or 10 different places where the same method names are defined and you're like, which one is getting called? I have no idea. And so it takes a while to go poke through all that. So because it was looking for this method on that, and this is the module that we included in user that I showed earlier. So we include action text attachable, and by default it's rendering to partial path in other places. So I just added this method that was missing and have it go to the same default. And that was it. We're fixed. Fix the bug with action text, which is cool. It took me a long time to get to this point because the whole SGID thing is not documented anywhere. No one ever talked about it. I kind of understood roughly what we needed to do, but I eventually, talked to George and he told me how to do it and confirmed some ideas. And I was able to get it to that point, and then I was like, well, this feature doesn't seem like it's complete. So then once I got the fix in, you know, because I was just playing around with it, I just wanted to make sure it worked. So I was fiddling with the code first and not really doing TDD or anything. But once I knew that I was on the right track, I wrote a test, and basically, you know, we create a new page, imagine that it's some attachable object embedded somewhere, and that this method will be called on it, and we just want to make sure it matches the default partial path. And so that's kind of the rough, you know, direction I went with coding up that. And I made, you know, this PR. I mentioned George because he knew about it. I figure if I mention him, then he'll review it and click merge, and we'll be done. And then he actually recommended Javon, who also works at Basecamp on this feature and tricks and stuff like that, to review it. And they approved it and merged it into Rails, I don't know, 6 beta 2 or something like that. So I got, you know, my first commit here. It was like March 11th or something this year when they merged it, which was cool. So as I was doing this and testing a bunch of things, I was like, you know, it'd be really nice. It'd be really nice if I could run a generator like this, where we have Rails generate model, your page and titles, kind of normal, but these are the new generators that I wanted to add. So I wanted to be able to say rich text, because that is the action text rich text, and they have the rich text area field type. So I wanted to be able to do this and say, cool, just, you know, add action text right into my page without having to set it up manually or anything like that. And while I'm at it, it would be nice to just do the same thing with active storage. Like, they're just adding one line to the models that get generated, not even messing with migrations or anything. Should be easy to add both of those. And it was not, of course. So I decided, you know, this may be a feature that they would want to accept. And it seemed logical. Like, I was thinking about it, like, why doesn't Rails have this already by default? And it seems kind of obvious. So I just decided to work on this one without actually, you know, messaging one of the maintainers and saying, hey, would this make sense? I just was like, that'd be fun, and I'll get to learn about the Rails generators, see how that goes. So poking around, Railties is a gem that actually contains a lot of the like Rails code around the generating a Rails app itself. So the generators folder has this generated attribute file in it, and one of the methods, because basically I'm just looking to find, you know, to add this, I just need to go register another name somewhere so that those generators would work. So I found this, and I was like, cool, I'll add a when rich text and then rich text area, and see if that changes the form that is generated, and just made that change with the local Rails app and ran it on a brand new app, and it worked. So I was like, cool, you know, I didn't even have to change anything else. This went and added a new field into Rails, which is awesome. So next thing was just below that method, there's a method for defaults. And as you can tell, you probably can recognize that my string and my text and some of these values are what you see in the fixtures. This is effectively what generates those default values. They're just hard-coded in this method in Rails generated attribute file. And so I just was like, cool, I guess I'll just drop in rich text here. The reason I put it here instead of with like text, I could have put it in text as well, probably, but the references and belongs to are associations, and so is technically rich text. It will work as an attribute kind of seamlessly on your model, but it is technically a separate database record for all of that, just like your active storage attachments. So I thought it made more sense to go in the references and belongs to line there instead. Maybe that'll change, I don't know. And then I noticed some of the other ones had little helper methods there just to check what type it was really easily. And so I added these, and this was the first one I started to realize that was a virtual attribute, where it's not actually generating a database column, because they have ones for belongs to and references, which will also generate a database column for the ID, and if it's polymorphic, belongs to, it will generate the underscore ID and underscore type columns. And the rich text then becomes the only one of these types that is a virtual attribute that doesn't need to be in your migrations, which led me down the rabbit hole, as most contributions to something as complicated as Rails does. I have to go and begin modifying the templates that are generated. So the first thing was this is the template that generates your Rails models. So class name, when you specify Rails generate model page, class name is page, and it's just printing out a Ruby file using ERB as if it were any other HTML template. So it's pretty cool, just super simple, but it's using ERB. And then in some of the other more complicated files, you'll see a strange double % syntax, which is actually used for this template is ERB, but it's generating an ERB template, and so they double nest the ERB to escape it. It's kind of weird to read. But that was all I figured I was going to have to do to add the rich text to the model. That's where your other lines and stuff are defined, and so it was as simple as adding a couple lines there. But as I was testing that, I forgot, that all of your migrations are going to actually create a column for those types that you specified. So in this case, we don't actually want a type for it. So I had to add that virtual on line 9 and say, look, if it's a virtual attribute like rich text or active storage, ignore those. We don't need database columns for that. It was the first time that anyone's ever built a generator for these like virtual attributes that aren't actually columns on there. So so potentially this is a point of where Rails core team may say, nah, sorry, like you're starting to stretch this past what it's designed for, because everything so far and the generators for models and stuff have been only for actual database things. And now I'm saying, hey, what if we make this also handle this other like stuff that's kind of similar but not actually database columns? And they could say, sorry, like let's just keep it simple and just use it for generating database columns. Luckily they didn't say that, so my time wasn't wasted. So that is the migration template, and these get a little weird because their file name is .tt, which is just to denote it's a template, but really you could do like a .erb on there. They just don't want to get it confused. So then the other thing we have to go do is also, I think my arrow is off there. It should be on line 10. But the other thing we have to do is modify the fixtures, which is actually under the test unit generator folder. So all of the different things that Rails generates when you run like Rails generate scaffold, they're spread out across a bunch of different folders, and it's confusing because some of the stuff looks like it's right there, and then it turns out, it's in the active record gem or it's in the JBuilder gem or something, and it just gets a little bit hard to track down exactly what you need to do. And sometimes you may need to edit like these templates in 3 places to add the features, so it works if you have JBuilder turned off or whatever. So what seems like a simple contribution ends up being a lot more than you think. So then adding tests for this was pretty simple. Like most of these things, you just go and read through the test files and find other tests that are similar and just copy and paste them and change them to test what you want. So in this case, I confirmed that has rich text is spit out in the model file, and there's no value set for the fixture because we didn't have any default text for that. So the same one, just went through and just made a very simple pull request to that and just kind of tried to shop it around to a few people and was like, hey, go thumbs that up to hopefully make sure it gets merged. So that was the rich text one, and I kind of did that right after the action text stuff, which made it kind of, flow from one thing right to the next one. The action text, or the active storage attachment generators, were a little bit hairier than I was expecting. And the reason for that is because this was another part of Rails that's never really existed before. This is generating, so I went through the same process, but for these active storage files, I wanted to print them out on the scaffold's show page, so links to the files. So line 6, I added if this is a singular attachment, let's create a link to that file name. And here you can see that crazy, this is ERB outputting ERB. So like line 10, there's div and a double %, and line 9 and 11 have the same kind of thing. And then it also gets a little weird too, because those minuses, like on line 8 at the end, -% greater than, that is actually telling ERB to do stuff with the spacing, so that you don't end up with, sometimes you have your ERB templates that have crazy spacing because you had just a certain style of nesting in your ERB in your code. So these, you have to be a little bit careful with them, but I went through and was like, okay, we'll just print out those attachments and add them in there. I did the same thing. I went into the generated attributes, added those attachment things in there, just like that. So line 79, added the attachment and attachments. I believe for the attachments, there's another method in there for options or something. So I made that, I believe multiple is true, so you could select multiple attachments if it's plural. And then the thing that hasn't been done before, which made this a little bit more complicated, was when it generates your controller, all of the stuff that it supported before was just regular attribute names, so they're just joined by commas. But now we have attachments, which is plural, which now needs to accept an array. So it's introducing this new thing, which had to go and change a bit more than I was hoping. But it does now go ahead and generate all of the attribute names as symbols joined by commas, and then after that, it goes and does the same sort of thing, but it will add all of the attachments as the attachment name, like photos : square brackets. So it can accept those in the controller by default. And that turned out to be the only time that Rails scaffolds or the generators has ever supported multiple submissions or whatever for a parameter. So that was like, okay, this is starting to get more complicated than I had planned. We have to go change. This used to be that method previously. Line 39 was all inline in the template, so I had to extract that out to a method in the generator and spit it out here instead, as it was getting a bit more complicated. And I spent, I don't know, an hour fiddling with stuff on this specific thing because I went and changed it, and it seemed like it was working. But it turns out that JBuilder overrides the controller template. So I was editing the Rails template, trying to see my changes, and nothing was happening. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? So I went into the code and tried to figure out, there's some path that it goes through and finds the templates in. I need to print out that array and see where the hell it's looking for this template, because it's not using the one I'm using. And then I found it was JBuilder. And so then I realized I had to go change, another gem and the Rails stuff just to keep them in sync. And some of this you need to accept, because now you're coordinating stuff kind of like microservices, where if one depends on the other, you got to make sure they're both kind of done in sync or in the correct order. So I made the contribution for this to Rails, it got accepted, and then I did the JBuilder changes. And so there were similar things to this. The JBuilder partial also has the JSON version. So we needed to print out the rich text stuff, like on line 4, attachment and attachments is plural, and loop through those and just define a format so that, if you generate this, you don't get a JSON thing that ignores it, but it shows up in some files. It would be weird if it wasn't consistent across the board. And this was another thing, JBuilder tests are actually running against, I think, every version of Rails, and they didn't have any really, nothing about JBuilder was unique to a specific version of Rails until this. So it's another one of those situations of like trying to add a new feature ends up, now I have to run a few tests here that are only for version 6 or higher where that feature is there in Rails. So it ends up just like a small feature like that that I thought was going to be easy, like the rich text one was, ends up being a bit more complicated and takes more time than you would expect. So those are two things that I ended up doing recently for the generators. The JBuilder stuff is still kind of outstanding, so hopefully it gets merged in soon, but it can be released independently. So why do all this work to contribute to Rails? For me, I wanted these features. There were things that would make screencasting easier because I'm adding action text stuff and attachments all the time. So they make perfect sense for that to be in the language. It felt like a good way for us to have more people adopt action text and active storage and stuff, and be just easy with those. It's good experience. It's a complicated code base. So learning how all the generators work, all of that is built on Thor, which most people probably haven't ever dove into, but it's a really awesome tool for building like command line scripts and stuff. And that's what all your Rails commands generally are written in, which is great. So now I understand that. I understand how all the templates work. Just lots of things that I know now about Rails that I wouldn't otherwise. And they will just come in handy later when I'm debugging things or who knows what. Like it gives me a lot of ideas too on how they organize code, how I might organize my code better. Some of their stuff seems a little overly disorganized maybe, but it's just like, it feels complicated. So maybe, it's going to give you ideas of things not to do. And then it's just a good thing to do to contribute back to Rails and the open source community and stuff. So if you want to contribute, it's going to be easiest to work on new features of the framework. They're the ones that are the buggiest. There's lots of opportunities like these features that we walk through. There's just all kinds of stuff that's not documented. Things don't work quite right. Some things maybe need more tests, you name it. So it's good to kind of focus on new features of a library or framework or whatever that you want to contribute to. You should always talk to the developers, the maintainers of the libraries and gems and whatever, and make sure that what you're proposing makes sense before you waste a few days going and building a feature that they reject. Done that in the past. You learn some things, but it's also kind of a little bit of wasted effort. So it's good to talk with them. And they're just good people to know, people to have in your arsenal. And then start with something simple and work up. Like I was just trying to make action text work as my first thing. And I was like, this doesn't quite work intuitively. I'll go fix that. And then, oh, here's another idea. Here's another idea. I have 4 or 5 other things I'm going to try and contribute now because one thing led to another. And hopefully I'll be able to add some more cool stuff to Rails. So that is it.
Say talk to the core devs. How do you find the right core dev to talk to and get their attention so they?
Good question. Usually what I do is just look at the Git history and the Git blame and say, oh, George did 90% of this work. Let me go tweet him or mention him in an issue. And if you @mention them, they almost always show up eventually. Some of them are really busy, but that was what I did, and it seemed to work pretty well. And hit them up on Twitter, GitHub, or wherever. Email them if you want to. That works pretty well. But the people who, worked on the feature, any of the Rails core team that you see, if you go into the Git history, all those people who are making active commits to things or merging in stuff, also good people to mention. But generally, someone who's responsible for that feature is the ideal person to talk to.